All right, good morning, everybody. This is Peter Crosby. With me, we have Harley.
Hi.
Aiden wasn't able to join us today, apparently has a cough, so if you see him on campus, slap him upside the back of his head and tell him to socially isolate. This is our inaugural online lecture for USU 1300, and today we are going to be talking about the history of the two-party system. So just a couple of basic guidelines for people in the class. If you have questions, go ahead and throw them up in the USU Live chat. We will try and respond to them as they come through. The other thing is, for students of the class, please note that for 48 hours after this lecture, we'd like you to go ahead and pop into your Flipgrid discussion group. Let us know your thoughts on this, ask some questions, respond to your peers' questions, and hopefully we can have a good dialogue going that way, even though we all can't physically be in the same place. So today what we're going to do is we're going to give you an overview of the two-party system. Harley is here so that this is not just kind of a straight lecture. So Harley is your stand-in. I'm going to put her on the spot and make her as uncomfortable as I can for like the next 30 to 45 minutes. So thank you, Harley, for being our volunteer for this. With that being said, we will go ahead and start. So in the United States, we have a bipolar political process because we have a two-party system. Now, bipolar doesn't necessarily refer to a mental health concern, although some people do think it's kind of crazy. It's more of the fact that there's only two central positions of power within America's political process. So in 2020, we have the Republican Party and we have the Democratic Party. If you want to get elected to office, you need to be a Republican or you need to be a Democrat. That's just kind of how it goes. When you look at the makeup of Congress, when you look at who's elected to the White House, when you look at who serves in a federal court system as a justice, we are talking about people who are Republicans or Democrats. We have a handful of independents in the House and the Senate. Historically, we've never had an independent president in the modern era. George Washington is sometimes considered an independent, but really he was kind of a federalist, but we'll get to that in a minute. And so really the American political power structure is bipolar. There are two positions. Now that has some advantages and it has some disadvantages, and we'll talk a little bit more about that next week on our Tuesday lecture. But for today, what we wanted to get going was just the basic history. What's the history of the Democratic Party? What's the history of the Republican Party? Where did they come from? And does it matter? Like, does it matter that they have these unique identities associated with them historically? So Harley, any questions off the top of your head before we get started on this?
No, I'm just interested to learn more about the history of the political parties and if they were always so extreme. And also, I think an important thing to touch on would be when we vote for an independent party, I've grown up thinking that that vote is basically meaningless because they never win. So just if we touch on those things.
Okay, yeah, and if we don't, remind me, and we'll try and circle back to them. The concept of extremism is kind of interesting. What do you mean when you say extreme?
So I'm just saying that I feel like historically Democrats have been democratic, obviously, but there have always been principles in the Democratic Party that they don't agree with, and the same with Republicans. But I feel like the country may be at a spot now where if you are Republican, that's such a label, and you're almost not. I don't want to say not allowed, but it's not encouraged that you also keep in mind that there are other ways to do things. So that's kind of what I mean by extremism.
Yeah, so that party identity kind of maybe is your only identity that really matters. So if you're Republican, then you can be Republican and other things with other Republicans. But if you're a Republican and they're a Democrat, there's just nothing else. Okay, no, I think that makes sense. So to answer the first question, yeah, we've always kind of been stupid about this. We have gone through phases where we have been more or less politically inclined, and we have gone through phases where party identity was more or less important to individuals. But America has always historically been something, a population that was really, they cared a lot about a party identity. Like if you were a Federalist, you were a Federalist, and that meant something. If you were a Democratic Republican, that meant something. And so there's always been hostility between the two major parties throughout U.S. history. But I would agree that it does seem like in the common American population, we tend to be a little bit more polarized in 2020 than we have historically been. So we'll start from there. Like I said, guys, if you have any questions or anything, just go ahead and throw it up in chat, and we will do our best to answer those. So we're going a mix of low tech with a really crappy webcam and super low tech with a whiteboard. All right. Yes, everybody can see this. So this is the basic history of America's two parties. So our first president is George Washington, and he is part of what we call the Federalist Party. We're going to shorten them with an F. Opposing George Washington and other Federalists like John Adams was the Democratic Republican Party. This is where Monroe came from. This is where Thomas Jefferson came from. And the fundamental disagreement between these two was largely around the role of government. So Federalists like Alexander Hamilton believed in a strong central government. They wanted a government that was robust enough to go ahead and provide direction to these 13 separate colonies that were now states. They wanted a government that was strong enough to provide for a common defense. They wanted a government that was strong enough to go ahead and ensure that we had like a common monetary system. And so they really did believe that the power of the federal government should be robust. These Democratic Republicans largely believed in the concept of self-rule. They were definitely proponents of what we might now call states' rights. And their geographic differences, which we'll get into in a second, certainly contributed to why these two parties had different kinds of political ideologies. Now, over time, so we'll say this is like 1800, the Federalist Party really stops being politically meaningful in about 1830 because the party itself is dissolved and they become the Whig Party. In 1830, the Democratic Republicans drop the Republican part and they're now just the Democratic Party. John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, is actually kind of responsible for this realignment. And so here we have our first major milestone as far as the American two-party system. So we start with Federalists and Democratic Republicans, and then after about 30 years we have Whigs and Democrats. This goes on for about another 30 years, and then we have in 1860 the dissolution of the Whig Party, and they become Republicans, and the Democrats persist. And so when you look at the two modern political parties in 2020, both of them can trace their roots back at least to 1860, but for Republicans, a lot of the ideas that they are focused on also might be traced back earlier to this initial Federalist Party. And it's kind of interesting as you look at the evolution of these party ideologies over time. If I was to ask you who the party of 2020 was that believed in a strong central government, that's going to be the Democrats,
Yeah.
right? And the Republicans are definitely people that espouse concepts like states' rights, individual state rule, a deregulated, decentralized government structure. So I don't know, hardly any questions about this? Anything you think students might want to know about this?
Yeah, so just like with what you said, it's confusing where it almost seems like they're switched. And so I'm just interested to know where we got where we are now. And also, was there a big difference where I know maybe it was just a name change, but with the Whigs and the Republicans, like what happened there?
Yeah, those are good questions. So, I mean, I think the most important one is, of course, why. Like, why did this switch happen and how did that happen? And then, what's the major differences here? Well, let's go ahead and talk about this Federalist Party. We're going to erase our super awesome timeline. For all of you that have been in class with me, now you know why I use the board, because my handwriting sucks and the board on the computer makes it easier. So, the Federalist Party, we are going to change how our board represented what we call northern interests. Okay, so this was a party that was mostly businessmen, the northeastern states. You're talking Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, and they had a focus really on maintaining the economic health of the country from an industry and manufacturing standpoint. This is where the bankers were, and again, they believed in a strong central government. And so Federalists tended to be from the Northeast. They tended to be industrialists, bankers, and then also independent farmers. Because the Northeast at this point, New Englanders, this is small farms, okay? This is where you have a lot of economic commerce as far as like whaling ships and other commercial endeavors around transportation. Man, that should say farm, not foreign. So this is kind of the Federalist Party. Now the Democratic Republicans, if they're not Northerners, if they're not industrialists, if they're not bankers, if they're not small farmers, who do they tend to be? 13 colonies, 1800. Southern states.
Oh, right.
Okay, so here we have
Slave owners.
Well, no, this is an important distinction, right? And I think this helps us understand a little bit about the different ideas between these two major political institutions at the time. So if you have a strong national government that mandates its will across all of the states universally, that's a threat to a slaveholding state. Because a slaveholding state doesn't want to risk the chance that a strong central government, controlled or influenced heavily by Northern interests, is going to abolish slavery.
Okay.
And so there's a real strong desire here to make sure that things like state rights are held as sacrosanct, right? We want a weaker, decentralized national government so that we can go ahead and maintain some of these unique ideas and laws for our particular state. In this case, it's largely driven by slavery. Now, the slaveholding economy is agrarian, so there's not as much manufacturing in the South as there is in the North by any serious means. And those agrarian lifestyles are typically historically thought of as big plantations, and that's true. So most of the politically active people had lots of land, they were slave owners, and that's how they made their money, but there's also a lot of small farmers that live in these states.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of family-owned properties where there might be no slaves at all that look very similar to these small farms up in the Northeast as far as the size of the farm and who's working it. But here we have Southerners who are slaveholders with an agrarian lifestyle, and we have New Englanders up in the Northeast that are industrialist bankers, and then some additional small farmers as well. And so this is the basic party breakout. And this is kind of where we see the initial division in American politics. So George Washington famously said, political parties are bad for American health. He didn't like them. He warned us against the problems that they could potentially cause for the American political system. And part of that is when you have a bipolar system, which we have, you put each other in constant conflict. And so, as Harley was mentioning earlier, if I self-identify as a Republican or if I self-identify as a Democrat, that gives me some default assumptions about people that don't identify the same way as I do, which is going to contribute to more deadlock. And what we have seen especially in the modern political era, say for the last 10, 16 years, is that deadlock has reached, or a real gridlock kind of standpoint, where these two political parties don't want to work with each other.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's the Federalists, that's the Democratic Republicans. Now, it's as far as who had power, when you look at like the White House, we'll use the White House as our measuring stick. Federalist presidents were George Washington, who was only kind of a Federalist, and then John Adams, our first two presidents.
Okay.
And then we had Democratic Republicans for the next 30 years.
Even Abraham Lincoln?
Well, so 30 years. So we go to 1800 to 1830 now, right? And then we have the Whig Party and the Democratic Party.
Okay.
So we have this division. Andrew Jackson, a populist, that's kind of what the Democrats represent. Again, still Southern slaveholding interests. Whigs, a reconstituted Federalist Party, pulling in some more support from abolitionist movements maybe, but largely again focused on this commercial activity in northeastern state interests. They have like one or two presidents over the next 30 years. So from 1800 to 1830 were Democratic Republican presidents, Jefferson and Madison, etc. And then from 1830 to 1860 were Democratic presidents with only one or two Whigs. And then in 1860, the Whig Party is dissolved. It becomes politically non-viable and is replaced by the Republican Party. And who's our first Republican president? Abraham Lincoln, right? Okay, and so where do the Republicans come from? Well, the Republicans come from the old Whig Party, so this is northern states, commercial interests, and significant abolitionists. The Democrats don't like abolitionism, again, because they are slave-holding states. And so this political party divide leads to an actual political divide within the United States. We have Republicans largely in the North, and we have Democrats in the South. We have a civil war, and so we have this not just ideological separation, but a physical separation between the two territories. So we have Republicans saying you have to stay in the Union, and we have Democrats, largely Democrats in the South, saying nope, we're going to secede from the Union, we're going to form our own country where we can still be slaveholders. Bloodiest conflict in American history. Far more egregious than what we see right now as far as political partisanship and people not getting along. I mean, we throw rocks verbally today. Trump tweets things against Democrats. Democrats tweet things against Trump, but nobody's shooting each other in the streets because of political ideology. And so when we talk about is this the worst that America has ever been? No, it's not. It just isn't. So after 1860 and the Civil War, Republicans basically control the White House for most of the next 70 years or so. We have largely Republican presidents. And the reason for that, again, is because the Republicans kind of won the Civil War, which really politically stamped down on the Democrats' power source. And again, the Democrats at this point were largely focused in these southern states, which had just lost an armed conflict. And so they have some political stuff that happens with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, where we're getting rid of slavery. We have huge influxes of Black Americans that decide to join the Republican Party because this is the party that granted them their freedom and abolished slavery. They become politically active. And so the Republican Party then is this kind of union between northern interests and people that didn't want to have slavery and freed slaves, and they're able to maintain power for quite a while. During this period of time, though, which is not necessarily the focus of this lecture, we have Reconstruction era in the South, which is where the North basically imposes a bunch of restrictions on the South as far as economic and political considerations before they'll fully accept the states back into the United States and full voting. So all of your representatives, all of your senators, we send troops down there to make sure blacks can participate in the vote. And so it's a really active engagement from the North initially. And then that kind of peters off as Americans are like, man, this is expensive. It's a lot of troops. It just keeps adding to tension, which we don't really love right now. And so the Reconstruction idea of we're going to force the South to fully accept Black Americans as citizens, we're going to impose, constraints on taking blacks out of the political process, we're going to actively protect their safety and security, all that stuff kind of slides away. And so in the South, we have the resurgence of the Democratic Party because the boot's not on them as heavily, and they're not slave owners anymore, but they're absolutely not huge fans of civil rights. Okay, this is a group of people that just fought a war to maintain slavery. They were defeated in that war. The people that they used to command and own are now voting, and so they put in a lot of restrictions on black participation. And we have this Republican rule up until about the 1930s, where again, largely it's Republicans in the White House. Now we have a major couple of events that lead up to the resurgence of the Democratic Party at the national level. One of them is World War I, where we have a Democratic president in office. And then the other one, of course, is the Great Depression. So you guys have your kids invade your video conferences. I apparently have my wife invade mine. So we have Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who's a Democrat, that gets elected in response to this huge economic upheaval that is the Great Depression. So the stock market crashes, unemployment rates skyrocket, the government doesn't do enough to help ordinary Americans from a lot of Americans' perspectives. We have the Great Dust Bowl, farmers are going out of business. And so we elect a Democratic president who says we're going to get a strong national government to go ahead and take action. And this is interesting, right? Because historically, these were people that said, we don't want a strong national government. We want a lot of states' rights. And now we're starting to see Democrats say, well, maybe we actually do want strong national government. And the history of this is really kind of interesting. So one of the most progressive presidents in American history was Teddy Roosevelt. Okay, so antitrust laws, the creation of the national park system, trying to make sure everybody got a fair shake was basically his political philosophy. Guess what party he was a member of?
Well, I would say Democratic, but now
Obviously,
I'm
this
gonna
is a
say
setup, right?
Republican.
Yeah, he was a
Yeah,
Republican president. And so the Republicans at the time that Roosevelt was in office in the early 1900s were very progressive about a lot of these kinds of social issues.
uh-huh.
We didn't like the meatpacking plants. We didn't want to have the poor unprotected. Those were concerns, that was issues that we felt needed to be addressed from a Republican standpoint. And then after Roosevelt leaves office, you see a pivot in the Republican Party towards honestly just big business interests.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Republicans become a party of deregulation. They become a party of kind of letting business do what it needs to do to grow, because we see business as kind of the engine for the American economy, and we want lots of people to make lots of money. You have these, they're called robber barons, our big train company holders. You have people like J.P. Morgan.
Mm-hmm.
And so these individuals kind of shift the political ideology of the Republican Party towards being less progressive from that, whatever definition progressivism usually means, as far as collectively making society is more socialist, I guess you could say, towards being, let's take a more hands-off approach. And that didn't work when we have this huge economic upheaval, right? This idea of that businesses are going to morally make the right choice didn't pan out very well. But also, more importantly, the Great Depression was so big that an individual state couldn't solve the problem. One business didn't have enough resources to take care of everything it needed to. You needed a strong national government to go ahead and inject capital and resources, and even some regulations to try and get everybody back on the same footing. That's why we have big national governments. And so Franklin Delano Roosevelt introduced a whole host of basically social programs, or socialism kind of stuff, in order to make government work for more Americans. This is where you see the introduction of Social Security. This is where you see the introduction of welfare. This is where you see the introduction of like workforce programs. This is where you see the introduction of unemployment insurance. Like this is where you see the introduction of banking regulations. So if you have $10,000 in a bank, even if the bank goes under, the government will still make sure you have that money. Like this is where we see this whole host of regulations. And so it's really interesting to note that we have this pretty significant ideological shift that happens between the Republicans as being progressive, and we're going to focus on every American gets a fair shake, and the Democrats saying we want states' rights, to now we have Republicans saying, well, we prefer to kind of take a hands-off approach, and Democrats saying we are going to have a super active national government. It looks like we have a couple of things that popped in here to the chat. Man, I don't know how old these are.
No, they just barely came.
So hopefully we can.
I've been looking.
Okay, so hopefully we can answer some of these. So we'll pause here on the history, and we'll address these. So why are there two political parties only in the United States? This is a really good question. Basically, it's because the American political system is built that way. So we have, and we'll talk about this more next week, but we have an election process that's winner take all. So when somebody gets elected, whoever gets the most votes is the person that gets elected, and nobody else gets anything. So if Harley and I were in a competition and I got 50% and Harley got 50%, there's no winner, right? But if I get 50% plus 1, then Harley would have 49.9999 whatever. I have 100% of the power, and Harley has 0% of the power.
But I would definitely win in that situation.
Oh, I have no doubt she would too. And so that voting process where we don't share power, where it's winner take all, really helps support this concept of two political parties, because if you don't have any kind of power sharing, there's no ability for any small parties to have a seat at the table. And if I'm a major political party and I'm sending my people to Congress to make the laws, or I'm sending my person to the White House to be president, who's going to write the laws about who gets to participate in politics? Me, because I'm the one making them. And so if there's two political parties, who's making laws about automatic ballots? Democrats and Republicans are. Who's making laws about minimum thresholds to participate? Democrats and Republicans are. Who's making laws about whether or not we're going to have any kind of power sharing system? Democrats and Republicans are. And so when you have two political parties that control the mechanism of power, there's really no incentive for them to go ahead and invite other political parties into that process. And so we have two political parties because we have a voting process that awards power, 100% of the power, to only one person or one political group. And then we have a process that keeps perpetuating itself because we have two political parties that don't necessarily think it's a great idea to have more political parties actively participating. And whether that's good or bad, we'll talk about, like I said, in next Tuesday's lecture, but that's why. All right. Oh, looks like Becky's already trying to respond to some of these. So why did the political shift happen? I think we talked a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think we touched a lot on that, and there's a lot of different, if you didn't notice, there's a lot of different shifts that did take place, especially around the Civil War and World War One.
And then we have the Great Depression, and then we have World War II, and then we have another big shift, right? So we'll get our handy dandy whiteboard again. I feel like Dora the Explorer right now. Which, totally off topic, we watched the live action movie.
Oh gosh.
Harley, have you seen it?
No, and I never will.
Here's the thing.
No, are you gonna say it was good?
It was hilarious. Like, I was not a big fan of this idea. I'm like, this is a terrible idea. And we sat down and watched it. I don't know who the writers were, but they like basically accepted the fact that this is Dora the Explorer, a live version, which is a terrible idea, and just ran with it. Like, there are so many jokes about what's going on here.
That's funny.
Like, so yeah, if you guys are in isolation and you're like, I have nothing else to do, you should totally give Dora the Explorer a shot. All right, is there a way for smaller parties to get any kind of voice? It's a really good question. Yes. And you actually kind of see that through what Bernie Sanders is doing in the Democratic primary process, which again is something we're going to talk about in a couple of weeks when we get to primaries. Well, actually next week. So I don't know if you guys know this, but Bernie Sanders is not a Democrat. He's an independent.
I didn't know that, actually.
Yep, so he's an independent. And he is far more liberal or progressive than a lot of Democrats are in the Democratic Party. By running for president and pushing specific ideas, he's actually pivoted the Democratic Party to be more liberal in the kinds of ideas it thinks are important to most Americans. So the concept of Medicare for all, this is a really great one. Joe Biden, who is most likely going to be the Democratic presidential nominee, isn't a fan of Medicare for all. He actually thinks that we should take the Obamacare system, inject some more money into it, and use that as a jumping off point to try and figure out the best way to provide health care for Americans. Bernie Sanders, though, because he has been such an effective primary candidate over 2 presidential cycles, has basically pushed this idea so well that the majority of Democrats actually support the concept of Medicare for all, even though their likely presidential nominee does not actually think that that's the best way to approach healthcare. And so I wouldn't be surprised if after Joe Biden becomes the nominee, if you see additional conversations about the party trying to come to terms with what some more liberal people, like Bernie Sanders, want to see happen.
Yeah.
And so one way for smaller parties to have a kind of voice is to actively participate in the larger party structure. On the Republican side, this happened with the Tea Party movement back in 2010. So Tea Partiers were not part of the mainstream Republican population by any means, but they were able to effectively shift the conversations that Republicans were having about things like fiscal accountability and about what it meant to actually be a Republican so well that they changed what the Republican Party looked like. Like, the Republican Party of 2010 is fundamentally different than the Republican Party of 2020 because of the Tea Party movement. And so small parties that aren't necessarily Republicans or Democrats are able to inject their ideas in a broader system and kind of push the big parties to take certain kinds of positions. That's a really good question. Do you think COVID-19 will decrease political polarization between Republicans and Democrats? I don't know, Harley, what do you think? You're pretty political in your feelings.
Yeah, I am. I do think that COVID-19 is something that is uniting for the country because it's something we're all facing. And so I do think that it has the I don't think it's happening that now, but I think it does have potential to decrease political polarization because it's something like we're all facing together collectively. It's an issue we all want to tackle, but at the same time, there's a lot of issues in our country that are uniting us that we all want to tackle. And I think that this is definitely a pressing one, but at the same time, there are other topics that are very pressing that I feel like political parties should put more um, thought on, and then just saying, okay, we're all human. What can we do to make this better for everyone? So I think it has the potential to, but at this point, I don't know if anything really can decrease the polarization in our country.
So I will say this. I think it's interesting to know what's recently happened in Congress, right? So
Mm-hmm.
you have Nancy Pelosi, the head of the House, who pushes through a $1.5 trillion aid package that she negotiated with the Secretary of Treasury. Trump's Secretary of Treasury. That's who
Mm-hmm.
was her negotiating partner at this. And that bill passed the Senate, which is led right now by Mitch McConnell, another Republican.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think in times of real crisis, the system still works, right? We're not so broken that we can't actually accomplish something when we need to. And it's really interesting to note the kinds of measures that are in that bill. Like we're talking about now universal basic income for American citizens for maybe the next 2 to 6 months.
Yeah.
Like that's not just something that people are spitballing. Like now they're saying, yeah, this is going to happen. We just have to figure out how much Americans are going to get.
Mm-hmm.
And guys, I don't know how to break this to you, but that's socialism, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it has the support of President Trump, and it has the support of notable Republicans like Mitch McConnell and Mitt Romney, who was one of the most fiscally conservative people that the Republican Party ever floated.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have these ideas that seemed untenable in a normal political environment that now both Republicans or Democrats are like, yeah, we got to do this.
Mm-hmm.
On the flip side, we're talking about spending billions and billions of dollars to bail out major industries like the airline industry, and Democrats are going to sign off on it. Like they're going to say, yeah, I mean, if push comes to shove, we're going to give them the money to make sure that they stay afloat. And I think it's interesting that this is only happening because we have something like COVID-19.
Yeah.
All right, so oversimplifying, someone from a smaller party can only participate effectively in the current system by infiltrating the main political party.
Yeah, that was my question.
That's a good one.
Because I think what I'm wondering, and I hope that I'm speaking for you guys in what you're wondering. I'm wondering if there's a person that goes into an election and instead of trying to like really touch on Republican policies and like really try to make your campaign, persuade Republicans to vote for you or going after Democrats, is it possible for someone to be successful as an individual saying I'm an independent and having new ideas on things? Is it like possible for them to be successful?
Well, and I think it depends on the scale that you're talking about. So we've never had an independent in the White House.
Mm-hmm.
I'll be honest, Trump's not really a Republican, like he wasn't.
Yeah.
But he was the most, trying to think about the right way to phrase this, the most energetic candidate that the Republican
Mm-hmm.
field put forward in 2016. He's the one that created the most enthusiasm. He's not a real Republican, like he's not, if you look at his political ideas. And so we've never had an actual independent in the White House, but we've had independents in the Senate.
Mm-hmm.
We've had independents in the House. We have independents that serve as mayors. We have independents that serve on city councils. We've had independents as governors, although that is harder to do. We have independents that serve in state legislatures sometime. And so I think it is possible for non-Democrats and non-Republicans to participate as independents in the political process. It's just so hard.
Yeah.
Because if I say I'm going to run for office in Utah and I come out and say I'm a Republican, I have a built-in base of support. Like just the fact that I have declared myself a Republican means that I'm going to go ahead and be the Republican candidate for people who also self-identify as Republicans
Mm-hmm.
once I make it through the initial selection process. The same thing for Democrats. If I run as an independent, I have to convince both Republicans and Democrats that their own candidate is a worse choice than me. And that's a harder sell, right? Because they already have a self-identity associated with their political party. So it was a good question. Why is it not feasible for the two parties to share power? Well, let's talk about feasibility for a second. And I apologize. We planned on having the stream go about 30 to 45 minutes, so we're probably going to wrap things up here in about 10 minutes or so. So I'll answer a couple more questions, then we'll finish the timeline here. Feasible is an interesting word, right? Because it introduces concepts of likelihood. Is it possible for them to share power? Sure, anything is possible, but what does that look like? Like, candidly, what does it look like? We have a winner-take-all system. And so if Harley's the Republican and I'm the Democrat, and we run for office, she has voters that support her, I have voters that support me, and Harley wins. Who is Harley most concerned about at that point?
My own people.
Yeah, because they're the ones that voted you.
But
that's the practical reality, because they're the ones that voted you into office.
Right.
And theoretically, they voted you in because you have ideas that they liked more than my ideas in a utopian system, right? And so your ideas are the ones that are going to be brought to the table because you feel like people voted you into office because you have ideas that they want to see implemented. And those ideas are probably not the same as mine. They're probably very different from mine. And so when you talk about sharing power, what do you mean by sharing power? Like, that's a really interesting concept. Do you mean that both of us have the chance to govern?
Probably just that, like, the way that I'm taking it is just how, can we find balance within that so that it's not one political party running the entire country, which can happen, but at the same time, there are still positions in Congress and in the Senate that make it so that's not the case. But like even in our situation now, there are a lot of Republicans in power. But at the same time, there's a lot of Democrats in power.
So the Democrats at the national level control the House of Representatives, the Republicans control the Senate, and they control the White House. So I mean, that would be power sharing, right? So you have different political parties controlling different major branches of the government. Back to the history lesson for just a second. We won World War II. I think everybody knows that, right? Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the president through most of World War II. He died. Harry Truman, his VP, became president. And after World War II, the United States entered what we call the Cold War, which was a bipolar conflict between us and the Soviet Union. Topic for a different class. But what that meant, in effect, is that American politics had this kind of idea that politics stop at the shore. Meaning that when we talk about international stuff, everything stops. Like, Republicans and Democrats both come together and we both reach general consensus about how we respond to external threats. So we'll have disagreements about what internal policy looks like, but generally speaking, we're going to align on how we should resolve external problems. And this is pretty consistent. So JFK, Lyndon B. Johnson are Democrats. They're the ones that escalated the Vietnam War, right? Eisenhower's Republican. He's the one that got us associated with Korea. When you go forward, you have Reagan, you have Carter, you have Bush, you have Clinton. All of these presidents are engaging in external actions that, generally speaking, seem to have general support. That doesn't mean that all Republicans like everything the Democrat president does externally, or all Democrats like the thing the Republican president does externally, but it does mean that in general we keep our political conversations mostly focused on internal discussions. Now, that wasn't always the case, but post-World War II, that was largely what the American political system looked like. And so when you talk about feasibility, then we have this idea that, yeah, they are sharing power, right? We are having this conversation about we're going to align on how we respond to external threats, and we're just going to fight like chickens when we talk about internal threats. And that's kind of gone away. Oh man, we have a ton more questions. So Harley, question for you. How long do you think we should let this whole chat go?
Well, I think we should answer the questions that we have right now briefly. If you guys have more questions, you can message Peter, you can chat with us. There's, we're still here and there's resources for you. We just don't want to make this too long where you don't want to watch the whole thing.
True story.
Even though I know everyone wants to watch me, I don't know if everyone wants to
Dude,
watch Peter.
Humblest TA I've ever had. That was just an honest statement. Nobody wants to see me. You'll notice I'm trying to be out of the camera as much as possible in this. All right, so Becky is being super awesome and trying to respond to some of these questions in chat, which I really appreciate. We're going to answer one more thought. And this is from Braxton Prince. What are your thoughts on President Trump's COVID-19 checks for Americans promise? You get to go first, Harley.
No, you go first.
No, I don't want to unduly influence your opinion.
No. He has no influence over my opinion.
I think it's probably a really good idea, to be honest with you. So we have seen these kinds of checks come out under Republican administrations before. Under the Bush administration, it came out after September 11th.
Oh, okay.
We had a financial inducement under the Obama administration when the Great Depression, Great Recession hit, but it wasn't a check, and so people didn't notice it as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think from an economic standpoint, COVID-19 is absolutely going to be devastating. It's already gutted several major industries. It's already impacted millions of Americans. The service industry is going to be hit really hard. When you think about people that are, going to work in the service industry, they don't have health insurance. A lot of them, they don't have paid time off. They don't have a huge stockpile of money just sitting on that they can be like, yep, I'm glad I can just go home and not work for 3 weeks. I'll be fine. Like, this is a really devastating thing for them. And I think even normal Americans are feeling significant pinches in a lot of ways. I shouldn't say normal Americans. I mean, Americans outside of the service industry. And so I think the fact that people will have some financial security is going to relieve a lot of the general anxiety that Americans feel, which will hopefully mean that we can weather the crisis a little bit more sanely, and means that the economy doesn't slump for as long. That's my thought on it.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think that at this time it's so important to avoid panic in our country because that's really going to make things a lot worse. And so I agree that just having, making people feel a little bit more capable financially, because that's the people that I've talked to, that's what they're worried about with COVID-19. It's not, it's still scary to think about getting sick and to think about the repercussions that come from that. But economically, people are really scared, and I think that it's just a barrier there that can help people from just going really crazy about it. We really need to not panic, and we need to stay calm and just do what we can. And so I do agree with that.
So, I mean, it's not a cheap solution, but I think it will cost us less in the long run.
Yeah.
All right, so last part of this history lesson, and then we're going to cut this off so people can go do something else with the rest of their day. We ended in World War II. Great. So we have a Democrat in power. We're going to change this because that's awkward to write. So here we are. This is WW2, and we have a Democrat in office. And then from here till about 1970, Democrats mostly control the White House. So we have the Eisenhower administration, which is a Republican administration, but largely this is Democrat control between 1933, which is pre-World War II, through World War II, up through 1970. Then we have the Nixon and Ford administrations, which are Republican. So we're going to put this all the way out in 2020. I cannot write well at all. So we have Republican administrations, and then we have Carter, which is Democratic administration, and then we have Reagan. We'll put the Democrats down here, which is Republican, and then you have Bush Sr., which is Republican, and then you have Clinton, which is a Democrat, then you have Bush Jr., which is a Republican, then you have Obama. I know this is terrible. I'm sorry if you guys are watching this at home. And then finally you have Trump. The point of this is to show the White House has kind of bounced back and forth between these two parties over the last 50 years or so. The Republicans have controlled it more than the Democrats have in the last 50 years because Reagan was a two-term president, and Carter was only a one-term president. But largely, the White House has bounced kind of back and forth between the Republicans and the Democrats. Notice that there's no independence in there. There's no independence prior to this either. Like, if you were going to participate in national politics, maybe you get elected to the Senate as an independent. Maybe you get elected to the House as an independent. You don't make it to the White House unless you join one of these two parties. Like, if Trump wanted to run as an independent in 2016, Hillary Clinton would have won in a landslide. because he would have divided the Republican vote.
Yeah.
If Bernie Sanders runs as an independent in 2020, Trump's going to win in a landslide because he'll divide the Democratic vote. Either you are a Democrat or a Republican if you want to make it into the White House. So, Harley, any last thoughts or questions before we wrap this up?
No.
Okay. Well, guys, thanks for joining us on our beautiful disaster. If you have any questions or anything, let me know. But we look forward to seeing everybody next Tuesday. You guys stay safe out there.